When people think about inflation, they imagine prices slowly rising over time. But real inflation does not feel slow. It shows up fast. And by the time most people notice, their money has already lost a big part of its buying power. Throughout history, every major currency that lost value showed early warnings before the real crash started. The people who prepared early protected themselves. The people who waited paid the price. That is why the smart question is not, is inflation happening? But, what should I buy before my money loses more value? To answer that, we need to look at what people have done in every inflation cycle in the past 100 years. We have examples from the United States in the 1970s, Germany in the 1920s, Argentina many times, Zimbabwe in the 2000s, and more. Different countries, same pattern. The first warning sign is when the government increases money supply faster than the economy produces real goods and services. The public hears phrases like stimulus, quantitative easing, temporary support, and emergency measures. That is the polite version of printing money. Once new money enters the system, the people who receive it first benefit. The people who receive it last lose. This is called the Cantillon effect, and it is repeated in every inflation event. So the first group that prepares is usually the wealthy because they see the money supply change first. They know what to buy, and they buy fast. Most middle-class families wait, hope, and hold cash because they believe things will return to normal. They almost never do. So what should someone buy before their money loses value? The first category is real assets. Real assets are things you can touch, use, or live in. Real estate, farmland, productive land, rental property, and in some countries, even physical livestock. These hold value because they are not created by a printing press. In every inflation cycle, land and property rise in price because money is getting weaker while the asset stays useful. The second category is scarce assets. These are items that keep value because supply is limited. Gold, silver, and in recent years, Bitcoin has entered this category for many investors. Gold has survived every currency failure in recorded history. It is not a perfect investment, but it is a good survivor. The third category is essential goods that become more expensive later. Food, water filters, medicine, tools, energy supplies, and basic household items. Most people only buy what they need month to month, but during inflation, future prices become higher than present prices. So buying in advance becomes a form of saving. People who stocked basic goods early in Argentina or Venezuela saved more money than people who left their savings in the bank. The fourth category is skill-based assets. When money loses value, skills that produce income become more valuable than cash sitting still. Examples include repair skills, medical skills, growing food, construction, metalwork, software, and anything that solves real problems. In inflation, people pay for things they cannot do themselves. So skilled workers never run out of opportunity. Now the question becomes, which of these should come first? History shows the order depends on how advanced the inflation already is. If inflation is early, financial assets like stocks of strong companies may still rise because they own real businesses, land, and resources. If inflation is medium, physical assets start rising faster than financial assets. If inflation is high, only goods, property, skills, and scarce assets keep real value. During hyperinflation, people sell financial assets just to buy food. The key lesson is simple. Money is only valuable when it can buy useful things. When a currency loses trust, people want things more than digits in a bank account. So the goal is not to make more paper currency. The goal is to own what people will still want after that currency loses power. That brings us to the warning signs every inflation crisis shows. The first warning sign is rapid increase in national debt. A country that cannot pay its debt with tax revenue will print money to cover the gap. This always ends the same way. The second warning sign is when the government blames outside forces for rising prices, instead of taking responsibility for money printing. When leaders say prices are rising because of war, weather, greedy companies, or foreign problems, that means they are hiding the real issue, which is currency dilution. The third warning sign is when banks start lowering savings interest below real inflation. This means the system is designed to make holding cash a losing game. The fourth warning sign is when people begin spending faster because they expect higher prices later. When the public loses patience and starts buying anything before payday, the end stage has begun. So what can someone do before these signs appear? The first move is to hold less cash than usual. Cash is useful for short-term needs, but it is a melting ice cube during inflation. The second move is to convert extra cash into real or scarce assets. The third move is to reduce debt with variable interest because rates rise during inflation and debt becomes harder to pay. Fixed rate debt can be useful because inflation makes future payments cheaper in real value. The fourth move is to build or buy income sources not tied to one employer or one country. The fifth move is to store goods you already know you will use. And the final move is to study history because inflation always feels like a surprise to the generation that lives through it. During the inflation in Weimar Germany, people who owned farmland or physical goods survived better than people with bank savings. During the inflation in Zimbabwe, goats and cattle became more stable money than the national currency. During the inflation in the United States in the 1970s, people who owned gold saw it rise from $35 an ounce to over $800. In every case, value moved away from paper and into things. That is why the question is not what to buy to get rich. The question is what to buy so you do not get poor. People who focus on profit miss the point. Inflation is not about profit. Inflation is about protection. You protect by moving into assets before the crowd does. Once the crowd wakes up, prices jump and the chance is gone. This is why discipline matters more than prediction. You do not need to time the peak. You only need to act before panic. If food inflation begins, farmers win before traders do. If currency falls, gold holders win before stock traders do. If energy prices rise, people with solar, wood heat, or stored fuel win before commuters do. Every inflation cycle rewards preparation. Every inflation cycle punishes delay. So the first rule is simple. Do not wait for the news to tell you it is time. By the time the news says it, the price has already moved. The second rule is to stay liquid enough to act, but not so liquid that inflation erodes your position. Cash is still needed for daily life, so the goal is not zero cash. The goal is minimum exposed cash. The third rule is to think in real value, not currency value. If a tool costs $100 today and $200 next year, the tool kept value while the money lost value. The fourth rule is to avoid panic purchases. Buying slowly and steadily beats buying in fear. You do not need to buy everything at once. You only need to buy faster than inflation destroys your savings. Some people worry that buying assets before inflation is risky. History says the greater risk is doing nothing. The people who lost the most wealth in every inflation were the people who trusted the currency until the end. They believed the system would fix itself. It never did. The system always saved the issuer of the money, not the holder of the money. That is why personal responsibility matters. No one will save your savings for you. No one will replace your lost buying power. The only reliable protection is preparation before the decline becomes obvious. The last rule is to remember that inflation resets how wealth is measured. After the cycle ends, people are divided into two groups: those who kept assets and those who kept currency. One group starts the next cycle with strength. The other starts with nothing. You choose your group by how you act before the money loses value. Do not wait for permission. Do not wait for proof. Prepare while things still look normal, because they never stay normal for long during an inflation cycle. People who act early are never sorry they prepared. People who act late always wish they started sooner. History rewards early movers always. Prepare. Most people do not prepare because they believe inflation will be temporary. They trust official statements that say price rises are under control. But history shows that once inflation rises fast, governments rarely bring it back down without pain. The common response is to print more money to ease short-term pressure, which only makes long-term inflation worse. That is why preparation must come before public panic, not after it. By the time the average person realizes what is happening, the price of protection has already doubled. People who waited for permission always paid more than people who acted early. That is the predictable pattern of every inflation cycle. One of the most important strategies during inflation is shifting the mindset from saving money to storing value. Saving money in a bank account worked when cash held its purchasing power. But during inflation, the goal is not to save currency, but to save purchasing power. That means holding the things that money can still buy tomorrow. A gallon of fuel, a box of nails, a spare part for a machine, a supply of medicine, or a month of food are not speculative purchases. They are future expenses paid at today's price. In inflation, buying future needs is not hoarding. It is protecting yourself from a weaker currency. People in Argentina call this buying the dip, except the dip is the value of their own money. They shop before payday, not after, because the money loses value faster than the goods rise in price. Another lesson from inflation history is that governments often introduce price controls. Price controls sound helpful because they limit what sellers can charge. But price controls always lead to shortages, not lower prices. If a shop is forced to sell bread at a loss, the shop stops selling bread. If a farmer is forced to sell grain below cost, they stop planting grain. This happened in ancient Rome, in the French Revolution, in Soviet Russia, and many times in South America. Inflation plus price controls lead to empty shelves and black markets. That is why owning the product is better than relying on the system that distributes it. If something is essential to your life, do not depend on someone else to have it in stock. Another major shift during inflation is the value of time. In normal conditions, people are paid weekly or monthly, and they hold money until they need to spend it. But when inflation gets fast, the currency loses value faster than wages rise. This turns time into a liability. Money held for 30 days becomes weaker than money held for 3 days. In countries like Brazil and Turkey during inflation waves, employees demanded to be paid daily instead of monthly because the currency lost value every week. The only way to beat this loss is to convert money into value quickly. That means assets, goods, skills, or production tools. Inflation punishes waiting. It rewards action. One of the most misunderstood ideas about inflation is the belief that salaries rise to match prices. In reality, wages almost always lag behind inflation. Employers delay raises because they do not want labor costs to rise. Governments delay wage adjustments because they do not want to admit inflation is real. So workers always lose buying power first. By the time wages are updated, prices have already moved again. This is why people who rely on a single salary suffer the most in an inflation cycle. People with multiple income streams do better, not because they earn more, but because they are less exposed to one system failing. The safest income during inflation is income tied to things people will always need, not to titles or job descriptions. During inflation, people start selling items they do not need in order to buy essentials. This is called forced liquidation. First, people sell luxury items like collectibles, artwork, or expensive cars. Then, they sell convenience items like electronics, memberships, and furniture. Finally, they sell personal valuables like jewelry or family heirlooms, often at a fraction of their real value. This is why people who hold cash early in an inflation cycle can buy assets cheaply. But people who hold cash late in a cycle lose buying power so fast that even liquidation cannot save them. The only people who survive inflation well are people who bought essential assets early and bought them with strong currency before it weakened. Another pattern seen in every inflation cycle is the movement from cities to rural areas. When food gets expensive, people want land. When energy gets expensive, people want wood, fuel, livestock, and tools. Cities depend on supply chains. Rural areas depend on production. In the United States in the 1970s, the number of people starting small farms or homesteads rose sharply. In Venezuela, people returned to family land because city wages no longer paid for food. Inflation always exposes who controls production and who depends on it. That is why owning productive land has never gone out of style in any economic condition. Even a small garden becomes a strategic asset when food prices double. Another common mistake people make is believing that digital wealth is safe. Digital currency in a bank, stock held in an online account, retirement funds controlled by third parties, and digital records of ownership are all controlled by systems that can freeze, tax, or limit access during crisis. In Argentina and Cyprus, banks limited how much people could withdraw. In China, digital wallets were restricted. In Greece, withdrawals were capped. In Lebanon, banks shut down and people could not access their savings for months. The lesson is simple. If your money depends on permission, it is not fully yours. During inflation, control matters more than convenience. One of the major things people overlook is the role of energy. In every inflation crisis, fuel prices rise faster than food prices because energy controls food, shipping, farming, building, transport, and manufacturing. That is why smart inflation preparation includes energy backups such as propane, wood, solar, diesel storage, or alternative heating. In the United States in the 70s, energy shortages created long gas lines. In Europe recently, fuel inflation doubled electricity bills. Inflation reveals the hidden dependency every economy has on energy. So anyone preparing for inflation without thinking about energy is missing a core part of the system. Another asset class that holds value during inflation is tools. Tools do not lose value because they create value. A tool that repairs, builds, cuts, welds, grows, or processes has more economic use than a piece of paper money. In Weimar Germany, tools were used as trade currency. In Argentina, mechanics, plumbers, and electricians never went broke, even when currency lost 80% of buying power. A single tool that lets someone keep food cold, repair a roof, fix a vehicle, or grow food has more long-term value than a luxury product. People who prepare with tools are preparing for independence, not just inflation. Inflation also changes social behavior. People stop thinking long-term because the currency does not reward future planning. They stop saving, they stop trusting pensions, and they start buying only what they need right now. That mindset destroys the middle class faster than price increases alone. The death of long-term thinking is what collapses societies economically. That is why preparation must include mental discipline. Do not let the system train you into short-term thinking. People who think 5 years ahead during inflation become the next wealthy class after the reset. People who think 5 days ahead become permanent dependents. Another warning sign of coming inflation is when governments begin offering stimulus, subsidies, and relief packages. These are not acts of generosity. They are signals the government cannot fix the root economic issue and is instead distributing printed money to delay unrest. Every currency collapse in history was preceded by temporary aid that never ended. Rome issued coin debasement, France issued assignats, Germany issued wage support, The United States issued stimulus checks. Once the public accepts printed money as normal, inflation is already in progress. The next major shift during inflation is the destruction of trust in institutions. People begin to doubt official numbers, official inflation reports, official interest rates, and official promises. Once trust drops, people start creating shadow markets. They use barter, foreign currency, hard assets, or peer-to-peer trade outside the banking system. This happened in Greece, Brazil, Russia, and Egypt. Every time trust in currency collapses, trust in government numbers collapses with it. When the population starts measuring value in gold, dollars, Bitcoin, or food instead of their national currency, the inflation is entering its final stage. Another signal is when people who never cared about finance suddenly talk about inflation, currency, or investments. When everyone starts sharing survival advice or rushing to buy assets, the early movers have already won. Public interest always arrives late. When you see the crowd worry about inflation, inflation is already well underway. The goal is not to react with the crowd, but to act before the crowd. The people who bought silver at $5 an ounce were not the people who bought it at $40 an ounce. The people who bought farmland before inflation doubled did not need loans to do it. One of the biggest lies told during inflation is that it will be temporary. Temporary became normal in every historical case. Governments do not like deflation, so once inflation starts, the system is built to keep printing. Inflation is not an accident. It is a policy. It is a silent tax. It is the transfer of wealth from savers to spenders, from citizens to governments, from the patient to the reckless. That is why inflation is not just an economic event. It is a moral event. It rewards debt and punishes discipline. It rewards consumption and punishes savings. It rewards the first takers of money and punishes the last holders of money. So what should someone do right now if they want to prepare before things get worse? The first step is to audit your life for dependence. What do you rely on someone else to provide? Food, energy, water, medicine, repairs, transportation, income? The more items you rely on others for, the more exposed you are to inflation. The second step is to increase control over the essentials. Grow a little food, store basic goods, learn critical skills, hold some form of hard money. The third step is to build local networks because inflation makes distant systems unreliable. The fourth step is to own items that are hard to get once supply chains break. The fifth step is to reduce lifestyle burn rate so inflation has less to destroy. One of the smartest protections is owning assets that produce. A fruit tree, a rented room, a side business, a rainwater system, a solar panel, a workshop, a farm tool, a used vehicle that can be repaired without computers. These do not lose value during inflation because they do not depend on currency. They depend on human need. People will always need food, shelter, tools, repairs, and heat. Assets tied to basic needs rise in value when money falls in value. That is why the real rich do not buy assets. They buy control of systems. The middle class buys products. The poor rent everything. Another preparation rule is diversification, but not the kind taught in finance books. True diversification is not owning many different financial instruments. True diversification is holding wealth in different forms, in different places, under different rules, with different levels of dependence. One person keeps wealth in cash, land, food, tools, skills, metals, business, and trusted relationships. Another person keeps 70% in a bank account. Inflation will treat those two people differently. The first loses little. The second loses everything. Real diversification is not about growing money. It is about not being erased. The final thing inflation teaches is that time is wealth. Money can be created, time cannot. Inflation steals time by forcing people to work more hours for fewer goods. That is why the true goal of preparation is not just financial survival. It is keeping control of your time. People who prepare early get to live calmly while others panic. People who wait spend their time chasing solutions that were cheap years earlier. Your future quality of life depends on how you prepare while things still look normal. Your future quality of life depends on how you prepare while things still look normal. People who wait for official confirmation always lose time they never get back. People who act while the system still functions have more options and lower costs. Inflation is not about predicting the future. It is about reducing the damage of what is already happening. The signs are always clear to those who study history. Rising debt, a weakening currency, higher living costs, more government spending, shrinking trust and savings, people working more hours but affording less. These are the early signals every inflation cycle shares. The people who recognize the pattern early are the people who keep their freedom the longest. Another thing to understand is that inflation never affects all people equally. Those with assets gain. Those with debt tied to fixed rates benefit. Those who work with essential skills stay valuable. Those who live below their means suffer less. Those who depend on savings and salaries suffer most. The system is not neutral. It always rewards certain positions and punishes others. That is why learning what to own matters more than learning what to fear. Inflation is not something you escape by hiding. It is something you navigate by adjusting. Just like a storm at sea, you cannot stop it, but you can position yourself so it does not sink you. The people who survive are not lucky. They are prepared. Another point most people ignore is that inflation is not just rising prices. Inflation is falling trust. And once people stop trusting the currency, they begin to change behavior. They reduce long-term commitments, avoid lending money, demand payment in something other than cash, choose physical goods over digital promises, and stop believing official numbers. This breakdown in trust is what ends a currency, not the numbers alone. When trust is gone, the currency is already finished. A government can force people to use a currency, but it cannot force them to trust it. That is why every inflation cycle ends in a reset. Either the currency is replaced, revalued, pegged to something real, or abandoned. The people who hold assets during the reset have a bridge to the next system. Many people believe that when inflation gets bad, the government will step in and fix it. But history shows the opposite. Governments usually make decisions that protect the system, not the citizens. They raise taxes, freeze bank withdrawals, create new rules on ownership, limit foreign currency use, or force conversion of savings into government debt. These measures do not fix inflation. They trap the public inside the problem. The more control the government needs, the more it takes from savers and workers. That is why personal preparation outside the official system is the strongest protection. If the only plan someone has depends on the government doing the right thing, they do not have a plan. Another common belief is that technology will protect us. But technology does not change human nature, and inflation is caused by human decisions. A digital banking app does not protect savings if the currency collapses. A modern supermarket does not guarantee food supply if prices rise faster than wages. A stock trading app does not guarantee real value if the companies behind the stocks cannot function in a high-cost environment. Technology is a tool, not a shield. It helps only when paired with real resources. The people who survive inflation best are not the people with the most gadgets, but the people with the most essentials covered. Food, shelter, energy, skills, community, and adaptable income always come first. Inflation also changes what people value in others. Social currency changes. In stable times, status comes from luxury, titles, and appearance. In inflation, status comes from usefulness. A person who can repair engines becomes more respected than a person with a social media following. A person who can grow food becomes more valuable than a person who only knows how to buy it. A neighbor with tools becomes more important than a neighbor with opinions. In every economic downturn, communities reorganize around practical value. The earlier someone develops real skills, the less they fear losing conventional income. Skills are not just protection. Skills are portable wealth. At some point in every inflation cycle, people shift from asking, how do I save money, to how do I stop losing purchasing power? That shift changes everything. It changes what they buy, how they store value, how they think about the future, how they choose work, and how they measure wealth. Wealth is no longer the number in an account. Wealth is the ability to live well without permission. That means having control over the basics, not just access to them. People who reach that mindset early move from fear to strategy. People who do not adjust stay confused and frustrated while the world changes around them. Another major turning point is when inflation reaches a level where the public stops blaming businesses and starts blaming the currency. In the early stages, people say companies are greedy, landlords are greedy, grocery stores are greedy. But once inflation becomes obvious, people start realizing the money itself is the problem. When that mental shift happens, they stop saving in the currency. They start buying anything that holds value. They look for trade instead of wages. They look for storage instead of saving. That is when the real rush begins, and prices no longer rise by percentages, but by jumps. The goal is not to be part of that rush. The goal is to be the one who already has what others are chasing. It is also important to understand that inflation is not only a financial event. It is a psychological event. It changes how people see time, how they make decisions, how they trust others, and how they treat risk. In stable money, people think in decades. In unstable money, people think in days. The change destroys long-term planning in a society. When no one thinks long-term, nothing strong is built. That is why inflation is often followed by social decay, political instability, and cultural decline. Money is not just currency. Money is a time storage device. When the money stops storing time, the future collapses. Every inflation cycle eventually leads to a choice. Adapt early or adapt late. Early adapters feel strange at first because the world still looks normal. Late adapters feel desperate because the world changed and they did not. Preparing early is not about fear. It is about peace. It is about buying time. It is about not scrambling later. And the people who prepare early never regret it, even if conditions improve later. Because every item they bought was useful, every skill they learned was valuable, and every asset they gained built lasting stability. Preparation is never wasted. The most effective inflation preparation is not dramatic. It is gradual, intentional, and based on priorities. The strongest position is built quietly while prices are still tolerable and supplies are still available. The mistake most people make is waiting until they feel uncomfortable. By the time inflation feels uncomfortable, the cost of solving the problem has already doubled. The window is always earlier than the public thinks. Those who act before urgency never have to panic. Those who delay always face limited choices. Inflation removes options little by little until people are trapped in a lifestyle they can no longer afford. The solution is not to hope inflation stops. The solution is to build a life that inflation cannot easily damage. That begins with essentials. Every person needs food, water, shelter, energy, and work. Any plan that ignores these pillars is incomplete. During stable times, these are taken for granted. During inflation, these become the center of every decision. Food becomes too expensive to waste. Housing becomes too expensive to upgrade. Energy becomes too expensive to ignore. Work becomes too unstable to rely on only one source. The people who stay strong are the ones who built stability into these categories before the storm arrived. The difference between a crisis and an inconvenience is preparation. Inflation turns inconveniences into crises for those who did not prepare. One of the most reliable protections against inflation is ownership. If you own something useful, inflation cannot take it from you unless you are forced to sell it. If you rent everything and store nothing, inflation changes your life immediately. Ownership means control. Control means options. Options mean freedom. The fewer things you need permission for, the less inflation affects you. A paid-off home, a garden, a water source, a tool set, a second income stream, a stocked pantry, a reliable vehicle, a heating method you own, a trade skill no one can take away. These are quiet shields against inflation. Another overlooked form of protection is community. People who are isolated must solve every problem with money. People who are connected can solve problems with trade, help, skill exchange, shared tools, and cooperation. In every inflation collapse, one pattern is clear. Communities survived better than individuals acting alone. A person with food helps a person with fuel. A person with skills helps a person with land. A person with tools helps a person with repairs. Money is not the only currency. During inflation, it becomes the weakest one. Inflation also teaches that the most important wealth is the kind that cannot be easily measured. Health, knowledge, time freedom, resilience, adaptability, self-control, and problem-solving ability. These do not lose value when a currency loses value. They become more valuable. The people who fall hardest during inflation are not just those without money. They are those without capacity. Every strong position in life is built on capacity first, assets second, currency last. That order never fails. What makes inflation so dangerous is that it rewards denial. As long as people believe things will go back to normal, they postpone action. They wait for someone else to fix the situation. They believe safety will come from outside instead of inside their own decisions. But history shows that no one is coming to rescue the public's buying power. Once inflation rises, the burden is always placed on the citizens, never on the politicians or central bankers who caused it. Which is why understanding history is not a hobby. It is a survival advantage. So the wise path is not panic, but preparation. Not fear, but adjustment. Not waiting, but acting. The goal is not to predict the exact moment inflation becomes severe. The goal is to already be positioned when it does. You do not need perfection, you need direction. Every step taken before inflation accelerates is worth more than 10 steps taken after. Every dollar used to buy value now is worth more than $2 later. Every skill learned now is worth more than retraining later under pressure. Preparation is leverage against inflation. So, in practical terms, preparation means three things. First, reduce exposure to currency by converting savings into useful assets, goods, or skills. Second, increase independence in the essentials of life so inflation cannot fully control your lifestyle. Third, build adaptability so no single failure can ruin you. That is the foundation. Whether inflation stays moderate or becomes extreme, these actions protect your life rather than just your money. Inflation punishes those who only save. It rewards those who convert savings into strength. The final truth is simple. Inflation is not just about numbers. Inflation is a transfer of power. It moves power away from people who rely on the system and toward people who rely on themselves. That is why the greatest protection is not wealth, but self-reliance. You do not beat inflation by hoping for better leaders or waiting for lucky timing. You beat inflation by becoming harder to disrupt. A person who can feed themselves, fix things, stay useful, earn in multiple ways, and live below their breaking point does not fear inflation. They outlast it. Inflation always ends. The question is, who will be strong when it does? The people who prepared early will walk into the next era with assets, skills, and calm.